The year is 1867. A room in the Russian Foreign Ministry. St. Petersburg is frozen solid. Inside, a group of men stare at a map of a territory twice the size of Texas. It contains forests, mountains, rivers thick with salmon. It will one day hold billions in gold and oil. But these men do not see wealth. They see a bill they cannot pay. They see a mortgage about to foreclose. In 3 months, they will sell this land for 2 cents an acre. History books call this a mistake. They call it foolishness. They are wrong. Russia did not sell Alaska because they were stupid. They sold it because they were bankrupt. This is not a story about territory. This is a story about the ledger. This is a story about how an empire drowned in compound interest. We are taught that nations fall because of battles. We memorize the dates of invasions and the names of generals. But wars do not kill empires. Debt does. The Russian Empire did not collapse on a battlefield. It collapsed in a spreadsheet. The sale of Alaska was not a diplomatic blunder. It was a liquidation sale. It was a fire sale by a government that could not make payroll. The enemy was not Britain or France. The enemy was insolvency, and insolvency always wins. Rewind to 1856. Russia had just lost the Crimean War. For decades, Europe had feared the Russian bear. They feared the endless conscript army. They feared the Cossack cavalry. But the Crimean War exposed the truth. The bear was sick. The British and French invaded Russian soil and won. Russian rifles were antiques. Russian ships were made of wood, while the enemy sailed iron. Supply lines did not exist. Soldiers froze without boots. The defeat was total. But the military loss was nothing compared to the financial devastation that followed. Wars cost money, oceans of money. To fight the British and French, Russia printed rubles by the trainload. Inflation exploded. The value of the ruble collapsed. At the same time, the government borrowed heavily from European banks. They bought weapons on credit. They bought gunpowder on credit. They bought everything on credit. Now the war was over. The debts remained. The treasury in St. Petersburg was empty. The interest payments were eating the national budget alive. The new Tsar, Alexander II, looked at his empire and saw a black hole. Russia needed to modernize. It needed railroads. It needed factories. It needed to abolish serfdom and create a functioning economy. All of this required capital, massive amounts of capital. But no one wanted to lend money to a loser. The credit rating of the Russian Empire was in free fall. The bankers in London and Paris were wary. The Rothschilds wanted stability before they opened their vaults again. Russia was a bad risk. Russia was a junk bond. This is where Alaska enters the equation. For the Russian government, Alaska was not an asset. It was a liability. The Russian-American company ran the colony. This was a state-sponsored corporation like the British East India Company. But unlike the East India Company, which looted India for profit, the Russian-American company was bleeding cash. The sea otter population had been hunted to extinction. The fur trade was dead. The company was failing. It required government subsidies just to keep the lights on. So Russia was not only broke, it was also subsidizing a failing business on the other side of the planet. But there was a darker fear than just money. There was the fear of geopolitics. The Grand Duke Constantine was the Tsar's younger brother. He was head of the Russian Navy. He was a realist. He looked at the map and saw a strategic nightmare. Alaska shared a massive border with British Canada. Britain was Russia's mortal enemy. The British Navy ruled the seas. Constantine knew that if another war broke out, the British would simply sail into Alaska and take it. Russia had no Pacific fleet to defend it. Troops could not cross Siberia fast enough. Alaska was defenseless. It was a sitting duck. Constantine wrote a secret letter to the foreign minister. In this letter he laid out cold logic. He said the United States represented the future of the continent. He said that eventually America would want to control all of North America. He argued that if Russia held onto Alaska, they would lose it to Britain for nothing. The British would seize it as a prize of war. Better to sell it to the Americans now while they could still get cash. It was a strategy of cutting losses. It was triage. It was amputation. But there was a problem. The Americans were distracted. It was the late 1850s. The United States was tearing itself apart over slavery. The American government was paralyzed. They were not interested in buying a frozen wasteland from the Tsar. The Russian ambassador in Washington was told to wait. His name was Edward de Stokel. He was clever and charming. He was told to keep the idea alive. He was told to be patient. Then in 1861, the American Civil War exploded. For 4 years, the United States burned. The sale of Alaska was put on hold. But during this time, something strange happened. Russia and the United States became allies. It seems bizarre today given the Cold War, but in the 19th century, Russia and America were natural friends. They both hated the British Empire. During the Civil War, Britain and France flirted with recognizing the Confederacy. They wanted to see America break into 2 weak nations. A united America was a threat to their dominance. Tsar Alexander saw this clearly. He knew that if the Union fell, Britain would become unstoppable. So he made a bold move. He sent the Russian Navy to visit New York and San Francisco. It was a signal to London and Paris. If you intervene, you will fight Russia too. The American public went wild. They threw parades for Russian sailors. They saw Russia as their only friend in Europe. This friendship became the foundation of the Alaska deal. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the Union had won. But the U.S. government was exhausted. They were drowning in war debt. The Secretary of State was William Seward. He was an expansionist. He believed it was America's destiny to control the continent. He wanted Alaska. He saw it as a bridge to Asia. He saw trade routes to China and Japan. But he had a hard time convincing anyone else. The American people were tired of spending. They looked at Alaska and saw a block of ice. Newspapers mocked him. They called it Seward's Folly. They called it Seward's icebox. They asked why he wanted a polar bear garden. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, the situation was critical. The Russian treasury was running out of hard currency. Significant loan payments were coming due. The Tsar needed cash fast. He summoned Stokel back to the Winter Palace. The meeting took place in December 1866. The Tsar, the Grand Duke, the Foreign Minister, and the Finance Minister were present. The Finance Minister was the most anxious man in the room. His name was Reutern. He presented the ledger. It was hemorrhaging red ink. He told the Tsar that even a small sum from Alaska would stabilize the ruble. It would pay the interest on the Rothschild loans. They decided on a price. They would ask for $5 million. But they authorized Stokel to negotiate. They told him to get as much as he could, but the priority was to close the deal. They needed the money by next quarter. Stokel was given his orders. He traveled back to Washington, carrying the offer in his pocket. He was a diplomat, but he was about to become a salesman. Stokel arrived in Washington in March 1867. He went straight to William Seward. He found a receptive audience. Seward was eager. He wanted a victory to distract from the messy aftermath of war. Seward and Stokel began a game of poker. Stokel started high. Seward started low. They haggled over the price of a continent, but Stokel had a weapon. He knew Seward wanted this deal more than Congress did. He knew Seward was vain. He knew Seward wanted a legacy. Finally, they agreed on a price. $7.2 million. It was more than the Russians expected. The extra $200,000 covered existing Russian infrastructure. But there was a catch. The deal had to be signed immediately. Stokel wanted to send the telegram before Congress could wake up and block it. The story of the signing is legendary. It was the night of March 29th, 1867. Stokel went to Seward's house to tell him that Tsar had approved. Stokel suggested they meet tomorrow to sign. Seward pushed away his card game and stood up. He said, "Why wait until tomorrow? Let us make the treaty tonight." Stokel was surprised. He said, "Your department is closed. You have no clerks." Seward smiled. He said, "If you can muster your legation by midnight, you will find me at the State Department." So in the middle of the night, diplomats gathered. Clerks were dragged from bed. Gas lamps were lit. They worked feverishly to draft the treaty. Maps were spread on tables. Boundaries were drawn. The fate of Alaska's indigenous people was decided without them. They were transferred from one empire to another like livestock. The treaty stated inhabitants would enjoy all rights of U.S. citizens, but this promise would be broken for a century. At 4 a.m. on March 30th, the treaty was signed. Seward had bought an empire for less than 2 cents an acre. He was jubilant. He thought he had secured America's future. Stokel was relieved. He had secured liquidity for the Romanovs. He sent a telegram to St. Petersburg. It said treaty signed, $7.2 million. But the drama was not over. Signing a treaty is one thing. Paying for it is another. Congress had to approve the money, and Congress was in a foul mood. The House of Representatives was controlled by men who hated President Johnson. They hated his Secretary of State by extension. They saw the purchase as wasteful. They saw it as expanding the power of an unpopular administration. They threatened to block the appropriation. This is where the story shifts from diplomacy to corruption. Stokel realized the deal was in danger. He had promised the Tsar the money. If he returned empty-handed, he would be disgraced. So he did what desperate lobbyists do. He resorted to bribery. The Russian government authorized a slush fund. Stokel began to wine and dine influential congressmen. He hired powerful lobbyists. He placed favorable articles in newspapers. Thousands of dollars in gold were handed out in brown envelopes. The Russian ambassador was buying American democracy. It is estimated over $100,000 of the purchase price was used to bribe Congress. It was a dirty deal done in shadows, but it worked. The House finally voted to approve the funds. The check was cut. The transfer of money was complex. The U.S. Treasury issued a warrant for $7.2 million. But Russia did not want dollars. They wanted gold, and they wanted it in London. The warrant was deposited in a U.S. bank. The bank worked with the Rothschilds to transfer the value to London. There it was converted to gold bullion. It was deposited into Russian accounts. The money did not build schools or hospitals in Russia. It went immediately to pay interest on foreign railroad loans. The sale of Alaska paid the mortgage for the Russian railway system for a few more years. That is all. On October 18th, 1867, the transfer ceremony took place in Sitka. It was a somber affair. Russian troops lined up on one side, American troops on the other. The Russian flag was lowered, but it got stuck. A sailor had to climb the pole to cut it loose. It fell and landed on Russian bayonets. It was seen as a bad omen. The American flag was raised. Alaska was now American soil. Most Russians living there packed their bags. They did not want American rule. Indigenous people looked on with confusion and dread. They had not been conquered. They had not sold their land. But suddenly they had new masters. For the first few decades, critics seemed right. Alaska was ignored. It was governed by the military, then the Treasury Department. It was lawless frontier. The American public forgot about it. It seemed Russia had pulled off a scam. They sold useless ice to gullible Americans. But history plays tricks on the short-sighted. In 1896, almost 30 years after the sale, a prospector found a thumb-sized gold nugget in the Yukon. News spread like wildfire. The Klondike Gold Rush began. Thousands of men rushed north. Millions of dollars in gold were pulled from Alaskan rivers and mountains. In just a few years, America made back the purchase price 100 times over. And then came oil. In the 20th century, massive oil fields were discovered at Prudhoe Bay. The strategic value of Alaska became incalculable during the Cold War. It was the first line of defense against the very country that sold it. Soviet bombers were intercepted over airspace their grandfathers sold for pennies. Radar stations protecting America were built on land bought to pay a bad debt. The sale of Alaska is a lesson in short-term thinking. The Russian Empire was so focused on immediate cash flow that it sold its future. They traded a continent for a few years of solvency. They feared losing territory to Britain, so they gave it to America. They never realized America would become the rival that eventually buried them. But there is a deeper layer to this story, a layer involving the financial dynasties of Europe, a layer involving the hidden mechanics of how empires go bankrupt. To understand the true depth of this tragedy, we must look at the ledgers of the Imperial Ministry of Finance. The sale was not isolated. It was a symptom of terminal illness rotting the Romanov from inside. That illness was debt dependency. The Russian Empire in the 19th century was a paradox. It was the largest land empire in history. It had the largest army. It had immense natural resources. But financially it was third world. It had almost no middle class. It had almost no domestic capital. If the Tsar wanted to build a bridge or buy a cannon, he had to borrow from London or Paris or Berlin. Russia was the world's largest debtor. The Crimean War had blown a hole in the budget impossible to fill. But Tsar Alexander had a vision. He wanted to industrialize. He looked at Britain and saw the power of steam. He realized British power came not just from the navy, but the factory. He launched a massive railroad construction program. He wanted to connect Ukrainian grain fields with Baltic ports. He wanted to connect Euro mines with Moscow factories. This was noble, but execution was financial disaster. The Russian government guaranteed loans for private railroad companies. This meant if the railroad went bust, the government paid investors. It was a subsidy for incompetence and corruption. Railroad barons took the money. They built shoddy tracks. They pocketed the difference. The state held the bag. By 1866, the year before the Alaska sale, the Russian government spent almost a third of its budget just servicing railroad debt. Let that number sink in. 1/3. Not for defense, not for education, for interest payments. This is where the house of Rothschild enters. The Rothschilds were the bankers of Europe. They had branches in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples. They were masters of the bond market. When governments needed money, they went to the Rothschilds. The relationship between the Tsar and the Rothschilds was deeply uneasy. The Romanovs were autocrats and openly anti-Semitic, resentful of their dependence on Jewish bankers. Yet they had no alternative. Only the Rothschilds had pockets deep enough to keep Russia solvent. In the years before Alaska's sale, they pressured the finance ministry to stabilize the ruble with gold reserves, warning that without them, future loans would become ruinously expensive. The Tsar was trapped. He could not stop building railroads without admitting Russia's decline, but he could not afford to continue. The $7.2 million from Alaska was insignificant compared to total debt, yet vital as emergency liquidity. It allowed Finance Minister Reutern to reassure European bankers and refinance loans at slightly better rates. In effect, Alaska was sold to improve the Russian Empire's creditworthiness, a payday loan taken out by a superpower. There were voices of dissent. Some warned Alaska held vast resources and strategic value in the Pacific. They argued that abandoning territory signaled weakness. But these voices were silenced. Officials framed Alaska as costly, indefensible, and expendable, suppressing reports of its true potential. They believed selling it to the United States would secure a lasting alliance. They were wrong. The money vanished quickly, the debt remained, and the sale merely delayed collapse. Russia did not lose Alaska in war. It lost it to the balance sheet. Sovereignty, in the end, depends on solvency.